Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started with today's training, which is called 3 Steps for Developing Stronger Program Reports. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Meg Gibbon. I am Meta's Program Manager, and this training is offered through Meta, the Monitoring and Evaluation Technical Assistance Project. We do have an ambitious agenda today, so I'm going to jump right into it, but not before pausing to talk through some logistics in WebEx. So right now, everyone is on mute. If you do have any audio issues, you can type in the chat at any time, and we will try to help you out with those. And then you can always click Event Info to get the dial-in number and code to try to connect by phone. You can always raise your hand using the hand icon to reply yes to a question or to ask a question, and we'll go ahead and unmute you and open up your line. The chat bubble is at the top of the screen. Anytime you have a question, go ahead and type that in. You can also use the Q&A box, which is there next to it, and that will allow you to ask a question whose answer won't be shown until I type out the answer to it. And then later on, there will also be a poll, and in that case, I'm going to ask that you click on your answer choice, and don't forget to click Submit before I'll close the poll and show you the results. So for today's session, as you all know from the title, the goal is that you'll be able to identify 3 steps you can take to begin developing strong or stronger program reports. But another important thing that we're going to try to do today is talk through why reporting should be considered just one part of monitoring and evaluation, or M&E, for learning and action. And that's what I'm going to start off with. So why should reporting be seen as this, one part of M&E for learning and action? Often we're focusing on reports to our donors as the end goal or the stopping point when it comes to the data we collect, but really I'm going to try to convince you that it pays to be reporting as just one step in a longer process of using data to learn about our program, communicate what we've learned, and ultimately use that data to inform better program design going forward. And then before getting too much further, I just wanted to take a moment and pause to make sure we're on the same page about terms. When we say M&E, we talk about monitoring and evaluation. Monitoring in this context refers to the process of regularly, systematically collecting data, managing it, analyzing it about our project in order to learn from what we're doing, make decisions, and then adjust or shape our implementation over the course of the program. So we're not talking in this case about a monitoring visit or a grant compliance visit, although collecting that data can certainly be seen as part of a larger view of monitoring. In this case, we're talking about this team process of viewing our data and understanding our program over time. And then as for evaluation, this is the process of collecting and analyzing information, again, but in this case, typically once or twice during a project, so after a completed project or a project phase, in order to take a look back and assess a project or program's outcomes, the factors that influence results, and then in some cases, program impact. So I thought I would just quickly mention those 2 terms in case anyone had questions on those. So effective M&E involves a range of activities. You can see a lot of them here. I know this is a little bit of a text-heavy slide. Feel free to click View Full Screen if you want to see this a little bit clearer. And we do also have a downloadable version on our site. The activities you see here are part of what can be considered the data-driven and evidence-based program cycle. Just some examples. They can definitely vary depending on the program, but these are some typical ones. You can see initial program design at the top right, data collection, data management, and quality assurance as you get through the startup and implementation phase, and then into this end of project, or as you're thinking through designing your next project, reporting after you're analyzing and interpreting your data, as well as sharing and disseminating that, using it again to revise your theory of change in your program design going forward. So throughout these activities, keeping the focus on learning and action helps us keep our attention on what's really important, with the purpose of what we're doing. And why are we collecting the data we collect? What will that data enable us to do? Is it going to help us test assumptions about how our program works, make decisions about how to improve it, communicate to others about it in an effective way? These are all some of the reasons we collect data, not just for reporting. And where reporting falls in this process might be somewhere over here. I have put in 3 little reports in this implementation or end of project section. And my goal with this is to sort of demonstrate that although you're certainly reporting during one or multiple parts of your project, the deadline for submitting the reports isn't usually the end of the story. Reporting is not an end goal in itself, just an activity that takes place within the larger context of a data-driven program. So in submitting our report to the donor, we are sharing not only the relevant data, but also our analysis, our lessons learned, and then the actions or decisions we're planning to take in order to improve the program, and then of course ultimately improve outcomes for the clients we're serving. And then lastly, I just want to highlight that the learning I've been talking about here, the data we're generating, as it informs changes that influence a future program, can help us view reporting in a client-centered way. So along with research evidence, what we're learning here about client access, client participation in services, about the quality or the appropriateness of our services and the outcomes that our clients are achieving can help us revise our theories of change and make actual tangible changes to the program design, or even discontinue a project or a program that is not successful, not achieving those outcomes for clients that we did anticipate, and then identify new questions and learning priorities going forward, all in the interest of a client-centered view. Okay, so just to sum up quickly here, I'm advocating for you to consider reporting not an end goal, again, in and of itself, but one part of a larger learning and action-focused vision of M&E, one activity among many others in that cycle that we just looked at. Because this framing can help us ensure we're collecting and using purposeful data, considering whether the information we're reporting is the right data or all of the right data that we actually need to collect and collect in order to learn what we want to learn about our programs and take the right steps accordingly. That it also supports a client-centered view, prioritizing outcomes for the participants in our programs, right? So shifting the end goal from clicking that submit button to making informed decisions that have the potential to benefit the people we're serving. And then lastly, that it reminds us that data and learning should be shared beyond the report. So what this might mean is sharing what you're learning as appropriate with staff within your organization, potentially with partners, with key actors in your community as part of your public outreach process, and definitely back with participants or with clients themselves. So all with the goal here of contributing to better designed and more effective programs in the future. And before I move on, none of this is to say that reporting isn't an important activity. It certainly is. Definitely a critical element of the programs we deliver and ensuring accountability, but it's just not the only important use for our program data. So I'm going to pause here and open up a poll. So you should have just seen that pop up on your screen. And here I'm going to get ready to transition into the steps that we recommend you take in developing a stronger program report. And I'm wondering if your report was due this week or today, tomorrow, what steps would you need to take? And we've listed 3 options: 3 steps, checking your indicators, compiling the data and presenting it, just compiling it and presenting it, or just presenting it. You already have the indicators and you've already compiled the data. And if it's something else, just type it out in the chat, and I'd love to hear that. Great. I'm going to go ahead and close that now. So definitely some interesting results. Split, actually. The majority did say 3 steps, right? Check what indicators we have to track, compile that data, and present the data in the report. But others mentioned that they are further along. They just need to compile and present it. And it's true. We had a great response here from someone who mentioned that they would need to analyze it, which is absolutely critical and something I implied or I intended to apply when I mentioned compiling, but important to specify. I'm just going to share the results of that poll with you all. And then lastly, we have quite a few people who are ready to go. They are aware of what they're tracking and they are already compiling that over time, which is always great. So jumping into what these 3 steps are, you can kind of get a clue from the poll we just did, is what we think the most important foundational piece here is knowing from the start what you need to measure and how. And for some people, I know this might seem kind of an obvious piece or a given, but I think we've all had the experience of maybe thinking we knew this and looking at the moment that report is due and realizing maybe we didn't exactly know what we had to measure and how we were going to measure that. So I'm going to make sure we emphasize this. And then next, walking through setting up an effective data collection and management system that allows you to compile the data you're tracking over time so there's no scramble at the end of the reporting period to prepare that it's already ready for you, whether it's in an Excel format, a enterprise database, whatever you're using. And then lastly, presenting this information in such a way that you can communicate clearly about your program. And we're going to look through a few examples of this, including data and visualization. So starting here with step one, knowing what we need to measure and how we are going to measure it. So getting specific about what we are achieving through our programs, as you can see here, the outputs, outcomes, and the objectives of our programs is absolutely necessary for measuring the results in a report or in any other context where you're communicating about your program. And again, I want to start quickly with some terminology just to be clear what we typically mean about these different these different terms, although there is some variation in how people define these. But by the objective, what we're usually talking about is the condition, the state that you're expecting to achieve, not necessarily the overall goal of the project, which might just be something your project is contributing to. Something like clients are self-sufficient can typically be a goal if this project is not going to fully accomplish that. But an objective towards that might be that clients obtain jobs earning a living wage, just to give an example. And then working backwards as to the outcome, these are the changes that contribute towards the project's overall objective. So if we had that objective of obtaining jobs, maybe one of the outcomes towards that would be that clients are attaining a intermediate ESL proficiency or something like that. And then working back even further, the outputs of a project are the products, the goods and services, the immediate results that are produced directly by the project and that are required to achieve those outcomes. In this case, the example we're walking through quickly here are that clients are attending your ESL classes, you're delivering those, for example. So just a few of the key terms that you'll likely see when you're preparing a report. So if you're unsure of these, sometimes you may be unsure of the specific outputs, outcomes, and objectives you are having to include in your report. They should be the same ones that make up your project design. So sometimes they are predetermined by the donor, but in other cases, they are what you will have specified during the proposal development stage. So the one great way to do this is to map out a theory of change, which you have on the screen here. They don't always look like this, but the theory of change diagram is a type of logic model that really lays out all the building blocks you need to bring about the long-term objective and contribute towards the long-term goal. So it's a graphic representation of the change that your project will be contributing to essentially here, so using these arrows to demonstrate the causal pathways. So developing a theory of change, that process that you're sitting down with your team, maybe just submit a proposal or in preparation for a new project year, really helps you plan out what your program intends to do, how it's going to get there, and in that process, you're identifying the activities, outputs, outcomes, and objectives that you will likely need to measure to determine, hey, did we do that or did we not? So again, typically this is in your program proposal as a logic model, for example, as an attachment. So if you, maybe did that many months ago, or if there's been turnover in your team, you haven't looked at this in a while, I'd encourage you to review your theory of change prior to developing the report and make sure that everyone is on the same page about what is in there. And then if something like this doesn't exist for your project, it's never a bad idea to develop one. So it's a best practice to have a theory of change for every project you deliver. And we actually on Meta's website have a bunch of resources on this, including an e-learning module that you can check out if you're interested. So once you know your outputs, your outcomes, your objectives, you also need to know your corresponding indicators. So each of those outputs, outcomes, objectives is telling us what we're trying to achieve, but each of those things should be measurable, and the indicator is the variable that tells us whether or not we achieved it. So objective is saying what are we aiming for, and the indicator is saying how do we actually track that. So a variable that represents a valid measure of change. And fully understanding your indicators is the most basic approach to just knowing from the start what you need to measure and then how you're going to go about it. So we saw this example earlier, right? If your outcome is that, and we've made it a SMART outcome here, the one I briefly mentioned a moment ago, is that ESL program participants attain low to intermediate ESL proficiency within 6 months of program enrollment. Maybe that's the outcome for your program. The indicator that you'll actually measure is the percentage of clients who score at that level on the assessment that you are delivering, disaggregated by gender, by age, by country of origin, right, as the case may be. So just to kind of try to make it a little bit more tangible what we mean by outcomes and indicators for those who may be less familiar with these. And depending on your outcome, there could certainly be multiple indicators for it. You can have many indicators for a single outcome in some cases. And then sometimes there are multiple data points needed to calculate each indicator. So if it's a measure of change, you know, if this were instead of attaining a certain level, it was moving up by 1 or more levels, you might need, in that case, to track a pre-test score and a post-test score, right? It's not always just a quick data point you're plugging in. It's often a calculation. So in this case, if you're unsure of what your indicators are for those outputs, those outcomes, those objectives, the first step is always to review donor guidance. If they have required indicators, you do not want to miss those, so an important thing to think about. And then again, go back to your project design, your proposal materials to see if there were additional things you proposed, or if there were no donor indicators, what did you propose? A lot of the time, there may be a miscommunication or some confusion around a proposed outcome. You know, let's say your donor is requiring you to track how many community outreach sessions you held, but in your proposal you said, we're going to hold 5 community outreach meetings, but we're also going to have 50 people at each of those meetings. And so you want to make sure you're not just filling in the blanks of what your donor is looking for, but also is going back and thinking about what did you propose specifically, and are there additional indicators in there. Also review your proposal for the targets you proposed. So in this case, 50 people, 5 meetings, you know, 10% improvement in ESL ability or whatever the case is, right? So that's the target that you've attached to the indicator you're measuring. And I'll stress again here, knowing your indicators is again not just for reporting, but for collecting, managing the data along the way. This is what you'll also use for communicating your data to others, right? You know, you want to be able to share this information, these data points, with people who are interested in that. And so important to know these for those reasons as well. So another thing I wanted to briefly touch on here, for mapping these things out, both the objectives, the outcomes, the outputs, as well as the indicators you're going to use to measure them, and then going a step further and listing the means of verification or the source of that data is a log frame, right? This is a tool that you can use to make all of those things very clear and something you can reference throughout the project. It's again another type of logic model, so similar to a theory of change diagram in that way, but in this case it uses a table or a matrix format summarizing the key elements of a project strategy and how we're going to measure the progress in that indicators column, the source of data or means of verification, and then any assumptions needed for success of the project. So we encourage that you develop a theory of change first, making sure you're using SMART objectives, outcomes, and outputs so that can then pretty easily get pulled into this log frame format and explicitly define in this way how you're going to measure each of those things. Something that's sometimes done during project design, but if that did not take place for your program, it can be done at any point and is a great reference for you to have on hand throughout the project. And another plug is that we do have another e-learning module on this if you're interested as well. One step further on this, if you are in a complex project that has a lot of indicators or has indicators that are complicated to calculate, it's not a bad idea to get very specific about all the data points you need and where you're going to get it from. So this is an indicator matrix template that specifies that for you. It gives you an opportunity to number everything so that when you're talking amongst your team about them, you can easily reference what you are referring to. Talking about how the indicator will be calculated, disaggregated, exactly what data points are required, where you're going to get those things, who is responsible, the why, the purpose, that's a big one. Why are we doing this? Is it for donor reporting, but is it also for, in this case, monitoring quality of our services in an ongoing way? And then the targets that you attached, again, from your program proposal. So this is just a template. We have this you can download as well. I'll share links to all of these resources after this training. But something to consider if you have more complex indicators, or if you just want to go in a kind of the extra mile on the indicators that you have for your project. So any questions so far? I think I saw a few come in. I know I'm moving a little bit quickly, so don't hesitate if you have any questions. Okay, just looking at the chat, it looks like everyone's questions have been resolved already, so I'm just going to continue. And if you do have any questions, keep typing them in the chat or in the Q&A as we go. So our second step here, setting up effective data collection and management systems. So we walked through the first foundational piece, just knowing what you need to measure and how you're going to measure it. And so that's certainly the base that you're starting from. But once you do that, you also need systems for collecting the data, managing it, for example, in Microsoft Excel or in a database, and then ensuring that the data is high enough quality to actually analyze. And so this is the subject of step 2. So each indicator that we talked about needs to have an aligned data collection process. So what is the source data for each indicator is a question that you're going to want to ask yourself. If I return to that ESL example that we mentioned briefly, if one of the indicators is percentage of clients who complete the ESL training, you're going to need the number of clients who do, attend, who complete the training, something that maybe you need an attendance sheet to calculate. And maybe you're going to need to divide this by the total number of clients you have enrolled because you want the percentage who actually complete the training. And that might be collected via enrollment forms. So you have to make sure that not only you're counting who's all enrolled, but also who is attending, who's completing the training, for example. And then roles and responsibilities, right? Who will collect this data and how frequently? Are you collecting that attendance data during every session? Are all staff collecting it in the same way, right? Or maybe someone's just counting how many people are there versus those individual names. So you can take a look at who specifically is there, disaggregate the data by different demographic characteristics. And then how are we going to assure data quality? So beyond just collecting this data, how would we know if it's good or not? If it's not good quality, the report certainly won't be either. And so who is in charge of checking the quality of the data we collect and providing accountability for staff to make sure it is high quality? Just a few questions to ask yourself when you're thinking about data collection. When you're wondering if, thinking through this data quality piece, wondering what data quality is. Just briefly on this, there are a lot of different criteria, but one that we like to mention is that quality data meets the 3 C's criteria. It's complete, nothing is missing, there are no dashes or letters where there should be numbers, things like that are would indicate incomplete data. And that it's also correct. It actually reflects the reality of the program. It didn't say 500 people attended when only 50 did. And that it is consistent with what we expected. So, for example, we aren't seeing the same number appear over and over again. One thing to look out for is preferential end digits, like all numbers ending in a 0 or a 5. I've seen this with data in certain programs. If you're seeing, 100, exactly 100 every time or exactly 50 every time, how likely is that to be consistent with what we expect? And then data should also be relevant. It has a purpose. It's the right data to collect for reporting, for making decisions, whatever the case is, or both. And that it's timely. It's collected and reported in a time frame that actually allows it to influence our decision making. So ideally determining your process to assure data quality, in addition to identifying the data sources and actually collecting it in the first place, like we just talked about, is something you'll do prior to the project starting. But I would say review this at any time. You can really integrate data quality assurance into your regular program meetings, checking in on how many clients are being served, what outcomes you're seeing, what trends are emerging. All of these things are going to help you to prioritize the ongoing collection and monitoring of data as part of that data-driven program cycle. So for an example here, so we mentioned this outcome earlier and the indicator, you already saw those, but then the source of data or means of verification, where are we actually going to get this information? So is it that paper assessment distributed in the ESL class? The scores are entered daily in the program spreadsheet or database, by whom? The instructor. And so we have the frequency, the person responsible, we have the tools here all specified so we can know that that's happening. The takeaway on this is just to keep in mind that we're ensuring the data collection and management plan, or the steps that we're taking, the process we're following actually aligns with the data we need. That we're following processes to collect this data, that we're ensuring it's high quality, but that overall the data that these processes are surrounding and that these processes are enabling us to have is data that's actually useful. Later on, we're going to actually return to this example and show how we can manage this, structure an Excel database where the source data collected aligns with the required indicators that you can then include in a report. So personally identifying information is something I wanted to be sure I didn't skip over here. And so I just wanted to address the subject of what PII is and how do you safeguard it. So personally identifying information is any information that alone or when combined with other data can trace an individual's identity. And the reason that I wanted to mention it, although always important to mention at any time how critical safeguarding PII is that when it comes to reporting, you want to make sure you have an effective data collection and management system that specifically has a process for dealing with personal identifying information, and that ensuring that what you're including into the report as well is not personally identifiable. So if you want to attach some documentation into your report, do not include an attendance sheet with client names on it. You want to make sure that those Social Security numbers, alien numbers, etc., are all removed. Everything is de-identified. Some further resources you can find on this are ORR guidance on safeguarding and sharing PII. There's a policy letter that you can find online that has a little bit more information about what PII is and what systems are needed to manage it. And so this is just a quick overview of a few concepts to think through when you're setting up effective data collection and management systems. And I'm going to transition now into that piece around actually managing the data. And before we do, I'll do another poll. In this case, I'm just curious to learn from you all. What data management system do you actually use? Is it an enterprise database, something that your organization is paying for and you have seats on, everyone is logging into with an account? Is it a spreadsheet database like Microsoft Excel, Google Docs, things like that? Are you managing your data with a paper tracker, something like that, or something else? I'm just curious on this. Yeah, all of the above coming through in the chat, definitely. Certainly a combination is common. Okay, great. I'm going to give a few more seconds on this and then close it. No one had mentioned paper forms yet, but the majority mentioned the spreadsheet database, Microsoft Excel type systems to manage data, which is what we're actually going to focus on. I'm glad to see that there are several people on the call who use this because this is what we're going to demonstrate next. Some dummy formats for managing data that can help facilitate strong reporting and strong decision making from the data you're collecting. And then these type of templates or structures that I'm going to show quickly are also things that you can use for structuring custom reports in an enterprise database like ETO, Salesforce, Client Track, some of those other things. So a basic Excel structure or a data management structure is important because if you're using this type of database, the data needs to be structured in such a way you can easily analyze it, aggregate it, communicate about it in the reporting format. So just some tips for structuring data effectively are that your rows should be cases. Clients, most of the time when we say case, not really referring to resettlement case here, but referring to rather than the variables such as client name, date of birth, status, etc., the row should be the case that all of those things are referring to. Or in the case of aggregate data, the row can be your indicator where your target, your actual, things like that, or your columns or variables. And I'll show what this looks like in a minute. I know this might sound new if this is new, so I'll show an example. And then another thing here is to make sure your cells are containing clean values. So we talked about data quality earlier, but making sure that you don't have a mix of text and values, that if you have text, you're using consistent spelling, such as with controlled lists or controlled drop-down menus. That's really the best way in a table format like this to ensure that people are selecting from predefined choices rather than, one person's typing in Congolese and one person's typing in DRC, you want to make sure they have a controlled list in there. Those predefined choices for presenting needs or yes, no are going to prevent variations that you can see in a paper format or an open text field. And so what this can look like is something along these lines. This is all fake data, obviously, where you have each case as a client. In this case, you have a client name in a row. Here, or the client is the case, whereas the variable is going down, the date, the person who recorded this service. Maybe this is an intake spreadsheet that you are filling out here, the status address, right? All of this information for a client is structured in such a way that the data is easy to analyze. So that's the main thing here. And then the option here is to use controlled list choices, you know, refugee, asylee, SIV, something like that, so that people are able to select those under the status column or the type of service, you know, case status, open or closed. And that makes it faster, too, for data entry. And you can see kind of what I've demoed here. On the bottom, I'll go back. On the bottom, I sort of was imagining this as a detail sheet or a service sheet. And then another sheet in your Excel spreadsheet, your Excel document, can be an indicator summary one, where using formulas, the data from the detail tab can automatically be pulled into an indicator format. And you know, really leveraging the power of Excel to do really basic calculations, but making sure that's not something that, I don't know, if you're anything like me, you don't want to sit down and do a bunch of math every time you want to see where your program's at. So relying on the program to do that for you is so helpful. And so something to kind of continue with the same ESL program we've been talking about throughout that you can do is set up your spreadsheet such that you're totaling the information from the table, from the detail tab, and you can have as many tabs as you need, as many sheets as you need for different reasons, and then pulling that in aggregate into a table like this. This is actually what Meta does for our program. We list out every webinar we do, and then we have our indicator number of webinars delivered and totaling it all here against the target that we propose for our project. And so it's something that can really be done in any context. And we definitely don't have time in this session to get into how to do that, and it certainly depends on your program as well. But if this is something you're interested in and are not doing yet, I'm happy to help work with you on this because I think this can make such a big impact in preventing the situation where you have to compile and analyze all your data right before the report is due, rather than having this quick look at any time throughout the project. Oh, quick question on I'm seeing on what is deviation referring to. So what you'll see here is it's just the difference. So for example, looking at this indicator 1.1, number of clients enrolled, our target was 100, but the actual to date was 60. Maybe that makes sense because it's only March and this is the annual target, for example. The difference between the target and the actual number that we have seen is 40. So we're 40 under. That's what the deviation is referring to. Okay, so moving into this third piece here around presenting clear, organized information to communicate about your program. So if your team is on the same page from the start about what you need to measure, how you're collecting that data, and then in what ways you are managing it, so those first sort of two pieces that we've talked about so far today, the reporting part itself is very easy. All that's left is to organize and present it effectively in your report. And if there's additional analysis that you need to do at this stage that is not being done via your data management system, that's the piece that you can really focus all your time on, which is important because that will enable you to think through what decisions can be taken, what actions can be taken based on your data, as compared to spending the majority of your time on just getting the data itself and getting it ready to go. So in presenting data, a few basic questions here. We're going to walk through a few different ways to do it when it comes to reports, but before we do, I wanted to just frame this by thinking through a few questions. So first of all, what are you trying to say? I know this might seem, again, maybe simple, but a lot of the time we have an idea that we need to report everything that has happened in a project, even if it may not be what the donor is looking for, or we're not trying to communicate necessarily, but that's the direction that we go inadvertently. So thinking through the goal of your report, really, and I think in most cases what it will be is to communicate the extent to which the program is operating as planned, including achieving the outcomes that it aimed to achieve, and explaining any deviations from that. So what are you trying to say with your report? It might not be exactly that. It might be something else, so think through that. And then certainly who's your audience? In the case of reporting, it could be a donor, but I certainly know that federal donors, private donors are not the same when it comes to looking through reports. You may also be interested in taking this process I've been walking through today for a totally different situation, right? Maybe making some public outreach materials, doing a presentation to your board of directors, right? All of those different audiences for the information that you have are going to change how you actually present it. And then once you know what you're trying to say and who you want to hear that, what is the most effective way to reach those people? If you're trying to talk to your CEO of your organization, maybe they just want a really quick graphic, quick visual, one visual about your program. They're not going to want to read a 15-page report, whereas your donor, given what they need to hear, who they are, maybe they do want to see all of that in the reporting format, right? So just a few basic questions to bear in mind when you consider what is required for a report that is effective, that not only meets the requirements that your donor is asking for, but that actually accomplishes the larger goal of communicating clearly, effectively about your program. So while a lot of the time a narrative format is the only thing that is required in a federal report, if you guys are submitting a program, standard form program progress report, sf-ppr, a lot of the time you're just being asked to submit a narrative, which is okay, but as you guys know, I'm sure by looking at this slide, a lot of the time text is not easy to immediately parse, and so we're going to talk about a few other ways to communicate data that is perhaps a little bit clearer, a little bit more compelling. But pausing here on the narrative format, since that's something that we're all doing as well, is a few tips for this particular way of structuring your information. The first being to organize your narrative by outcome. So we talked about the outcomes that you have in your theory of change. Give yourself some headings within your reporting format, if possible, unless it's so structured that you're not able to do this, but structure the text that you're including in this narrative around the outcomes that you aimed to achieve. And then if you have if you have objectives that these outcomes are leading towards, include that as well. So you talk about not only whether you're achieving your outcomes, but also whether you are working towards your objective, which is, objective is not just restating outcomes. It's, what those outcomes are contributing to. So you can talk about that each in its own section, so it's very clear what the information you're sharing has to do with your actual overall program, the program model. And so another tip in this, make sure that as you are including information, something basic, always confirm the reporting period that you are referring to, and you're not including information that's outside of that. A lot of the time, one trip up that happens is if you are writing a semi-annual report that's due in the fall because it's an end of fiscal year report. Typically, you're not including information that's from the whole year. It's just the second half of the year, and then you can reference additional things in your report that happened and talk about your annual targets. But really, the report is a semi-annual report, right? So that's one example of this. And you always want to be thorough, you want to be complete. Even though this may not be the best format to communicate information through, if this is the format it's in, make sure that all the information that needs to be in there is there. So all of the indicators along with the targets and the actuals are presented, because that's what you are required to do, and that's what the person reading it needs in order to know if your program is operating as planned. But all that is to say, there's probably a much clearer way to show this information. I think you will do the reader a service by also including a table. So this is very similar to the Excel example you saw earlier, the little fake Excel sheet I showed, and that's definitely intentional. The idea is that if you are tracking this in Excel, you can just click, drag, copy it, and pop it into the report, right? It is already there for you, and you don't have to calculate it. So that's why I wanted to really spend some time on that second step of creating a data management system, so that when you're producing these indicator sort of progress tables, you can immediately put it in a very clear way. Again, organized by outcome so that people are able to see how the indicators you're measuring do align with the outcomes that you're trying to achieve. So a table is a start for data visualization. Although a lot of experts will tell you that a table is one of the worst ways to visualize data. Right? It's better than no visualization, but people are not easily able to parse a table that is just full of numbers like this. You guys can tell me, at a glance at this, do you know if this program is doing well? Is it on track or not? I guess you've seen it a few times. Maybe you are quick on that, but there are ways that at a glance you can very easily see the status of a program, and that can always be great to communicate to a reader of a report. And so to show you what that can look like, something like this. It's a little text heavy. I actually might trim it down a little bit if I were to revise this again. But what you can do with data visualization, as you do, in whatever way makes sense, right? This is just one example. It's a what's called a thermometer chart. Basically, you have the it's a basic bar chart, but the bars overlap. The target and the actual bars are overlapping here. This is really clearly showing how you exceeded, in this case, you met one target, exceeded one target, and you're behind on one other target for these three indicators. And then you also have at the top here a descriptive title that communicates what you're trying to get across with this graph. So you say, you have a point in including information, right? So make that point obvious. The ESL program is on pace to meet our targets for proficiency and attendance, but may not meet its target for one-on-one tutoring. So that's what you want the person looking at this to take away. So you can go ahead and state it for them. There's no harm in doing that. Unless, I'll always make the caveat, unless you're not able to for whatever requirement that is in front of you, set by your donor. And so this is something you can easily do in Microsoft Excel. I'm going to show briefly a couple other visualizations to get you started thinking through this, but none of them are done in any other way aside from Excel. Nothing too exciting on this, and something that's quite easy to do once you do it. I'll also mention on this is that as an additional step, once you have that Excel, or if it's a custom report from your database, once you have those things structured in such a way that your indicator table is already calculating for you, that you have those progress against actuals done or ongoing kind of ready to go, you can have a linked visual, a linked graph within Excel. A lot of database systems will have a data dashboard like this, and basically allow you to look visually at your program over time and have that update all the time too, so that that's something you can just include in your report rather than having to create it explicitly for that purpose. So when it comes to data visualization, we could definitely do a whole training on this, but a few just principles that I'll mention here is one, to ensure that each graph has a clear point and typically only one point. You run the risk of not getting any message across if you try to get too many messages across with a single visual. Only visualize what the person is reading cares about. If they're not a statistician, they probably don't need to know the p-value for your analysis, your evaluation that you did. If the person is an audience that's less familiar with refugee resettlement, they may be more responsive to a graph that is just using words like participant or job seeker who obtained a job, or students, rather than getting into the nitty-gritty about immigration statuses and things like that. So really think about what the person cares about seeing in the graph, where they're coming from. Again, going back to this point we made earlier about knowing your audience. And then once you have that kind of in mind, choosing the right graph type to communicate that. I'll show a couple examples quickly in a minute, but just keeping it simple, one graph per point and nothing too crazy. I think that's always the best way to go about this. Like I just demonstrated, using the title to make a point. Don't make the reader guess what you're trying to say with the graph, unless, in some cases you want to leave it really open to interpretation. If it's something that you're tracking yourself on an ongoing basis and you don't want to have a kind of a message attached to it, you're just looking at it to see, clients in my program, then that's fine. Clients for FY18 as a title is okay. But in selecting information to put into a visual, you are already choosing something about that information. You're choosing what you're including, and so there is a point you're trying to get across in most cases. So if that's true for you, you can use the title to make that clear. And then I can't emphasize this one enough. Use colors, formatting, text, legends, tick marks, all of these things on here, lines inside your Excel graphs. Purposefully, sparingly, keep things really simple. That one way to go about this is to use a data label, rather than have a legend that's got a listing all different things people are going to try to have to match up to colors inside the graph. Just label the bars in the graph, label the sections of your pie chart, make that easy for people to understand. So those few examples I mentioned about appropriate graph types. Across all of these examples, you can see that we have no extraneous labels, axes, formatting, colors. The titles are all straightforward. I hope that you think these are relatively effective just by the fact that this slide is extremely busy. There's a lot on there, yet my hope is at least that you're actually able to absorb all the information on here just because it's very simply presented. When it comes to choosing an appropriate graph type, I've shown a few examples for just 3 different common cases that you may run into when it comes to reporting. Progress, that you have that thermometer chart that I showed earlier, really one of the most useful. If you have 5 different outcomes for your program, you could have one of these for each of those outcomes spread out throughout your report. Really useful for someone looking through at a glance to see where your program is at. To show portions or parts of a whole, an obvious choice can be a pie chart. Although one best practice with pie charts is no more than 3 slices of the pie. I'm sure we all have seen the pie chart that has 10,000 tiny lines and tiny slices in there, and you're trying to understand what is referring to what. If you have that, the pie chart is not the way to go. It's fighting the message that you're trying to say. So really 3, maybe 4 parts of the pie are all that your reader is going to be able to look at and compare it to each other, because you want to be able to see what the relative proportions of different things are with this. And so if there are so many that they can't look at them and compare them, then it's not useful. And another alternative for this is a horizontal bar chart, the 100% stacked bar chart, you'll see this called, where it's just a horizontal bar rather than a circular format. And then because, as you can kind of see here, I tend to favor horizontal graphs because, in the case where people are reading left to right, that is natural for people to read that way. So doing the horizontal stacked 100% bar chart is one way to do that. For the portion, kind of showing a portion of clients served or proportions against each other. And then if you're interested in visualizing change over time, one thing that I didn't show here, you can consider a line graph, again, a basic column graph. Bear in mind in that case that your months or your days should always be on the bottom, the x-axis, so that the graph should be read from left to right. Again, assuming that's the language people are reading in. If that's not, maybe there are a different best practice for that. But in most cases, right, you're reading left to right. The progression of something over time, which I know is often included in reports, should be going left to right along the bottom. I know this may sound basic for some of us who might be more familiar, but I know data visualization can also seem really intimidating for maybe people who might be new to it. And I want to emphasize that it's actually not something that's too difficult to do once you start playing around with it. This is all done in Excel pretty simply, really. Nothing too tricky on this. Okay, so I've been speaking quickly, I've been moving very quickly, and that's because I wanted to make sure I got through everything and left plenty of time for your questions. And so just to review the steps that we've walked through today, in addition to the preface that I gave around fitting reporting into a larger view of monitoring and evaluation for learning, for action, those 3 steps we walked through are knowing from the start what you need to measure and how. So that means knowing not only the outcomes, the outputs, the objectives that you are measuring, but also the indicators for measuring them, and then the sources of that data as well, right? Where are those things coming from? Then setting up an effective data collection management system that enables you to measure all of those things in a timely way, and helps you too if you can use some of those Excel tips that I mentioned, or if you can integrate those into a custom report for your database. Those things can save you time at the reporting stage by creating an indicator table that is calculating ongoing over time automatically, by creating even a data dashboard that you can lift the visuals from into your report. And then lastly, this piece presenting the information, presenting that clear information in an organized way, organized by objective and outcome, so that as the reader goes through your report narrative, they're able to see the structure of how each activity you did contributes to those things, rather than just simply describing all the activities you've done, in order to really communicate effectively about your program to the particular audience that you have, right? If it's a private donor who wants to just see really great photos and things like that in your report, that should be in there too, right? If that's the case. So thinking through what the audience is, what the best way to communicate data is it a narrative format, a table, a graph? I mean, I think this is usually a combination of all three, or other things like I mentioned, photos, things like that, that might also even, make your message even clearer for the people that you're trying to reach. Okay, so that's all I have, and I'm going to check through. It looks like we have all kinds of questions in the chat. But as I do, here's a quick slide summarizing what Meta offers for technical assistance to ORR-funded service providers. So if your organization, your program receives ORR funds, we can help you with all three steps that we talked about here or other many things. So I'll leave that up here and just quickly look at the chat. Okay, so one great question here. Any tips for how to account for data that cannot be collected? So for example, right, referencing the example that we've been talking about today, what if a client moves or is unreachable after the 6 months of ESL and the progress cannot be captured? So I think in this case, I wish I had a good solution for this. One thing to think about, if possible, I know, looking back is always hard, but in the beginning of a project, if you think that might be something you anticipate, if you have long-term outcomes, thinking about attrition and thinking, okay, what target can we propose that does take into consideration that we won't be able to recollect this at the, the post data at the end. So that can be something to consider if you need to think through that when proposing targets and things like that. But if you're in the position of having to do this, I think the best, it may depend, but the best way to go about something like this is you're using the denominator. If your indicator was percentage of clients who complete ESL in 6 months, that's the percentage of those who complete over those who enrolled. You could reduce that denominator to those who you were able to track the whole time. So those who enrolled and who you're still in touch with, that you can collect that. You don't want to have a program that shows 10% completion when you actually just were only able to get in touch with 10% of the people. It's not really accurate. But I guess at the same time, anything that you do would need to be clearly explained in the narrative of your report. You could even pop an asterisk on your graph if you're doing that. Welcome anyone else's thoughts on this as well. I think that's a tricky situation. And again, always go to the donor to ask them what they recommend. Great. Yeah, so one person mentioned, one comment here, the majority of our funders want to see the focus on the specific program versus in-depth information regarding, refugee clients specifically. Right, yeah, exactly. And I think that's something to keep in mind is, especially, for those who are maybe new to reporting, you may be tempted to show everything you've been doing because we're all doing so many great services throughout the year. But a lot of the time what the donor is interested in is in aggregate information, but as appropriate, disaggregated by the right demographic characteristics that they are interested in, or the right, whatever other characteristics it may be. So if the donor is looking for aggregate number of clients employed, you certainly don't need to tell them all of the different people who those employed clients were, but it may be of interest to say number of women, number of men, number in these different age brackets, different nationalities. If those things are telling a kind of important story that maybe women are less employed than men, rather than burying that into one aggregate indicator. So I think you want certainly the general aggregate data, but as appropriate, disaggregated. Great. I appreciate everyone who is interested in following up later. Do not hesitate to email us, meta@rescue.org. My name, again, is Margaret Gibbon, so margaret.gibbon@rescue.org if you want to contact me directly, but we will get it from that email address. And anyone who is interested in the PowerPoint, we will absolutely send that, as well as the recording, barring any technical issues of this webinar. We'll record it as a video. And I'll include links to all of the resources we talked about around theories of change, log frames, managing data. All right, I actually think that may be all of the questions and comments that we received. If there are others, I will stay until the end of the hour. But if not, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I will close the session here. Once you close this window, you should be brought to a feedback survey. It would be incredibly helpful if you fill that out to help us know what you're interested in hearing about in the future and how we can improve. Thank you again, everyone, and do not hesitate to reach out to us at meta@rescue.org.